Hi guys, it's Friday again and therefore, like every other Friday, time for a new video from me. I'm glad you're here again. Now that the Monster Adapter LA-FE2 makes it possible to use Nikon screwdrive lenses on the Sony E-mount with autofocus, I would like to introduce more Nikon AF lenses. Today it's the Nikon AF 3.5 to 4.5 35 to 135mm N. This focal length is interesting as a standard zoom for many photographers, who prefer a little more telephoto focal length and can cope with a moderate wide angle of 35mm. Perhaps one or the other will supplement this lens with a 17 to 35 or 20 to 35mm or similar lens. This would cover a wide range of possible applications. The autofocus zoom presented here, which came onto the market in 1988, was already the second autofocus lens of this focal length from Nikon. It replaced the first version introduced in 1986. There is also an older version of a zoom Nikkor 3.5 to 4.5 35 to 135mm AIS without autofocus. The two autofocus lenses of this focal length have a completely different body design, zoom method, and macro mode. However, the optical construction of the lenses remains unchanged. Also, the lenses have the same weight, the same number of aperture blades, the use of the same size of 62mm screw-in filters, and they use the same Nikon HB1 lens hood. The N version is much more comfortable to use, especially thanks to the rubberized focus ring. The second version, known as the N version, was launched 2 years after the first version, and for a while it was sold alongside the first version. It is interesting to see how Nikon updated its 35 to 135 lens class. First, the first manual zoom Nikkor 35 to 135mm AIS with push-pull design was updated to the autofocus version, which uses the focal length adjustment by rotating ring. After this version, Nikon opted for the push-pull design again as with the manual lens and released an update, the Nikon AF Nikkor 35 to 135mm N. Although the second lens version was in production until 1998, it was never updated until the D versions. The N version has a separate macro mode. To access this, you need to set the focal length to 35mm, press the small silver button on the macro setting dial and turn the wide, rubberized ring to the MF equals 35 mark. This position enables macro shots with a maximum magnification ratio of 1 to 3.5. The focusing distance from the sensor or film level is 39 cm. Autofocus does not work in the macro range. The Nikon AF 35 to 135N has quite fast autofocus on native compatible Nikon cameras. In conjunction with the Monster LA-FE2 adapter used here, the autofocus is a bit slower but mostly reliable. The shortest focusing distance outside of macro mode is as much as 1.5 meters, which is very bad when shooting smaller subjects. I would also have liked a shorter minimum focus distance for portrait photography. This is a drawback I see with all lenses in the Nikon 35 to 135 series. The focusing ring is rubberized and rotates during automatic focusing. Manual intervention is not possible. To do this, the adapter must be set to manual focusing. When focusing, the filter thread also rotates. Internal focusing is also not possible. The lens enlarges when zooming. It has a manual aperture ring. In order to use the automatic functions of your Sony camera, the aperture ring must be turned to the value 22 and fixed with the small lever located above the aperture scale. Please note that the AF Nikkor 35 to 135mm N does not transfer values for the focus distance to the camera. This can lead to exposure errors, especially when shooting with flash and TTL automatic modes. Here you can see an AF test of the Sony A7rIV with the Monster Adapter LA-FE2 and the 35 to 135mm. In conjunction with the Monster LA-FE2 adapter used here, the autofocus is a bit slower but mostly reliable. The mechanical quality of the lens is very good. As was common at that time, a lot of metal and glass was used. I love this production and finishing method. How does the lens perform optically with a modern 61 megapixel camera? I will first show unprocessed RAW files that I took with this lens in my Sony A7rIV. This is followed by the processed images. Decide for yourself whether the optical quality convinces you. Of course, I would appreciate a like, and if you subscribe to my channel, that would be great. First, let me show you one of the weaknesses of the lens. It is the distortion. At a focal length of about 35 mm you can see a very pronounced barrel distortion. This focal length is not suitable for architectural photography when uncorrected. Unfortunately, I have not found a lens profile to improve the distortion, so you will have to correct the distortion, vignetting, and other aberrations manually, if you want to and if you think it is necessary. When zooming into the telephoto range, the distortion changes from barrel to pincushion, but becomes less. In addition, the lens is very sensitive to flare, despite the use of the original lens hood. Losses in contrast are clearly visible, which should be taken into account in post-processing. Chromatic aberrations appear to be well corrected. However, I do not want to rule out the possibility that they may still be visible in critical subject situations. The macro range at 35 mm delivers good sharpness already at a slightly stopped-down aperture. This is certainly sufficient for everyday shots, but for reproduction purposes or serious macro photography, you will certainly want to use a special macro lens. What about the sharpness performance of the lens? In the next few minutes, I'll show you examples of different focal lengths and apertures. Please note that the raw files are not processed and therefore not sharpened. In general, the lens delivers good sharpness in the center of the image in the telephoto range. This makes it ideal for separating subjects from the background, as far as the small aperture of 4.5 allows. If sharpness is required almost right into the corners, stop down to at least f8, or even better f11. And even then, the outermost corners of the picture will not be crisp. But hey, the lens was designed for photography on film back then. Who could have guessed back then that it would be used on a 61 megapixel camera? This example clearly shows that it is not recommended to use the widest aperture for the focal length in order to obtain the sharpest image from corner to corner. Stop down to f11, the lens delivers very good sharpness at a focal length of approximately 50 mm. Only the contrast could be better at all focal lengths. The steady shot of the Sony A7rIV has done a great job here. The picture was taken at 1/20th second at 135mm focal length. Perhaps it would have been a little sharper with a faster shutter speed. As promised, I'll show you some processed RAW files at the end of the video. They can help you decide if you want to try this lens for yourself. My conclusion is clear: I wouldn't buy this lens separately for a Sony mirrorless camera. The optical performance is not convincing to me. If you own this lens and some other Nikon AF or AFS lenses, there's no reason why you shouldn't use them on your Sony with the Monster LA-FE2 adapter.